I had just gotten back to Budapest the day before from Bangkok, so I was jet lagged, and as it happened, woke up very early, I think at maybe 4 a.m., and looked at my phone and had a bunch of messages, but the top one was from Dan Deekhouse, who was at the NSC at the time, asking if I was going to be leading the earthquake response, and I had no idea what had happened. I flew with the ambassador down to the earthquake zone. We were there when the search and rescue teams arrived from Fairfax and from LA, and then began a very heavy and difficult task of, moving hundreds of people, dogs, equipment from an airport in Adana up into the mountains of Adiyaman, where we were going to be doing the search and rescue. It should take maybe 3 hours normally, and it took us almost 12 hours to get there because the roads were not passable. Cars were broken down. There were routes that had been sort of declared impassable by the civil defense, and it took us that long to get there. And I remember we arrived in the area where we were doing the search and rescue, and when we first drove in, I wasn't totally convinced that we were in the right spot because the edge of the town looked okay. It wasn't that bad, and we had driven through a couple of small towns that were devastated. But when we went into the town itself, it became clear very quickly that the extent of devastation in Adiyaman was enormous, and it was a good place for us to be. And the team started work immediately. When you go into a post-conflict setting or an active conflict setting, it's not uncommon to see a building that's been destroyed or damage to several buildings, sometimes very extensive depending on what the conflict is like. But what this was like, was as if every building in the downtown area had been hit by an airstrike, just, every single one. Many of the buildings were what they call pancaked, where all the floors collapse on each other. Others, bizarrely, were sort of tilting and leaning on each other. And these are big buildings, 8 stories, 9 stories, 10 stories, but leaning at very strange, odd angles, looking like if you just sort of push them and the whole thing would collapse. Huge piles of rubble with people climbing on the rubble, trying to find friends or relatives or belongings. Just really desperate to get people out because they knew that there were people in there. I mean, they had been inside those buildings themselves in some cases. And just seeing that level of destruction was something that I had never seen before, and something that I certainly haven't seen since, and hope that we don't have to see again. We do contingency planning in the field, at the regional office level, and had done a contingency plan for this scenario, and actually this, not for Turkey specifically, but for an earthquake. And we had levels of complexity that we built into it, and the Syria earthquake was the most sort of complicated, all the way at the very end of the spectrum. Because it was cross-border, because part of it was inaccessible, because it was an urban search and rescue operation with full teams. You can't really get much more complicated than that in terms of, mounting a full-scale response. It was also very hard on BHA staff. BHA staff who were based there were directly affected by the earthquake, had friends and family who were directly affected by the earthquake. And even in that, our team turned around and started responding, whether that was, officially as part of what we were doing, or in some cases, literally just helping their neighbors and family and friends in their environment. And that to me speaks to the dedication and resiliency of our team and the BHA staff, which is no surprise to anybody. I cannot speak highly enough about the way that the Fairfax and LA county teams conducted themselves and sort of held themselves to a very high standard of professionalism, but also a very high standard of courtesy when dealing with people. That really impressed me. They really did, I think, as much on the American diplomatic side, really, as anyone could hope, just in terms of being the face and the hands of the American people in that moment, and really just did an amazing job. So I continue to be very grateful for them for that and for the role that they played. So I think being a humanitarian in the international sense is fairly specific. It's someone who follows the principles of humanitarian response and of humanitarianism, and responds to humanitarian crises. And the way that I think about it is the kind of core first one is the principle of humanity, and that is, if there is a need and if there is a need for assistance, then you provide that need. You don't look at who it is or why they need it. You don't look at, are they the right nationality? Are they the right religion? Are they the right race? If there's a need for humanitarian response, that's what calls for humanitarian response.